Hello and welcome to another episode of Fiction Hack in what is a very special month. My name is Colin Munro and I'm joined by the all-knowing and infinitely wise co-host Ross Lawhead. Hello, how are you?
Hi, yeah, thanks for that introduction. See, I think I'm always uncomfortable because I don't know if people understand that that's a joke. Because I'm not all-knowing. I don't want people to think that I have all the answers. Yeah. But thank you anyway.
You are,
yes.
You are very smart. That's what I'm trying to say.
People don't see the preparation that I put into the episode, so it sounds like I've got all this information just at my fingertips. But
yeah, and we do often edit out some Googling and stuff like that. So I guess. Anyway, as I was saying, it is a very special month for two reasons, actually.
Okay.
The first reason being that both of us have our birthday this month.
Yay!
And what's the second reason? You want to tell us the second reason?
Yeah, so it's also NaNoWriMo. So we're actually recording this on the 1st of November, the first day of NaNoWriMo. And NaNoWriMo it stands for National Novel Writing Month, which takes place in November of every year. It's been going on for, I don't know, about 18 years by now, 18, 19 years. I only jumped on board a few years ago. And the idea is that you just you take 1 month and you write a novel. You do it in addition to any other job that you've got. But yeah, there's a large community kind of online, very supportive community. You can join writing groups in your area, go to write-ins. I've done that with my wife a few times. Just go to a cafe, meet some other people who you don't know who are also doing NaNoWriMo to write more of your book that day. And the idea is that you write a 50,000 word manuscript in 30 days.
Yeah. Now I think really it's actually grown. It's actually grown beyond national because it's international, really. Because I don't live in the States, but I've heard of it. So yeah, I used to live in Paraguay in South America, and I had some friends who were doing it there. They were American, but they were doing it in Paraguay. So
yeah, well, my wife and I did it in Scotland. So this would be the first time actually I've done it in the United States. And we may still go to a couple of writing communities, but yeah, there's a bunch of people in Edinburgh who wanted to get together and just write things.
Okay.
So yeah, it was great. And so I've completed it once. I've gotten the 50,000 words one time, and I've incompleted it. Failed it. I don't think they call it fail. Like I participated, but still, 40,000 words in a month is pretty significant chunk out of your manuscript. So yeah, I don't really.
So the idea is that you don't have to. You don't have to have a finished, polished novel by the end of the month. It's
correct. Yeah,
you get it's like a first draft, right?
A very rough first draft. And there's a book that one of the founders has written. A man called Chris Batty has written a book called No Plot, No Problem, which is a bit of it's not a great title because the book isn't really about plots. It is about problems, but he's very kind of above board in saying that you are going to get a very rough first draft of your book, but at least you've got that draft, something to work with. And I've actually kind of polished up one of the manuscripts to get it to a publishable state, and that's with my agent right now. And it was actually a bit more work in the editing stage, just because I'd written so quickly. There was a little bit more. It was a little bit rougher. There was a little bit more I had to cut out. A little bit more I had to kind of shave off or finish or rewrite. But all in all, you're still getting way down the road in a very short amount of time. Which for a lot of people, it's writing is a lot about just kind of. Confidence, and it will give you a good chunk of confidence along with that when you see here's my book. You can print it out and flick through all the pages and stuff, and so that's a good feeling.
Because as a complete novice, when I think about the act of writing a novel, I'm sure most people think of getting from the beginning to the end as maybe not the planning. You might plan it all out, but actually writing it is the bulk of the work. But in reality, it's more the editing and the redrafting and the editing process that takes maybe 90% of the time, or I don't know what percentage you reckon. I guess it varies.
It does vary, and a lot of writers don't like to do that second half of it. I call it half because for me it does usually fall out that way, where I'll spend maybe 6 months, doing the actual writing and research of the book to get the first draft, but then I'll spend another 6 months doing re-editing, redrafting, editing, all that kind of stuff. And I have actually come to really enjoy the editing side of things quite a lot. For me, I still find that a very creative phase of the project, but a lot of other writers feel like, just writing the words down, that's where the real magic happens. And the editing is just some kind of hassle that an editor makes you do later, which is not a very positive way to look at it. And I'm always an advocate for editing. I think it's smashing because you're always making it better. You're finding all the mistakes, and you are still it is still a very creative process. But I mean, what you said as well just now kind of segues pretty nicely into what our topic is going to be, which is kind of structure, particularly act structure, and what that is, what people mean when they say it, and my point of view, which is that why you should never really think about this as a writer. And I can unpack that a little bit as well. But in actually just kind of preparing this, because it was something that you had brought up when we were getting ideas together for topics for this podcast. It was like,
I think it was structure? Just something you mentioned, and I kind of then just had it in my mind as something that you wanted to do. Well, see, again, in preparing for this, I've tried to track down sources and, who are the first people to start thinking and talking about acts and structures and how to, just give your story some kind of a framework for you really to hang your story on, which I think is what people use it as. And that's certainly how we were taught at film school. I'm sure you had lectures in this as well. The film world, or so we say, the Western Hollywood kind of land, film world, really is really pushes acts structure. Acts, to think about your story in acts, and we can talk about why that is a little bit as well. Yeah, but I also want to kind of reasons.
Yeah, a lot of reasons probably. But also I just want to kind of highlight. Okay, so hopefully what we'll achieve with this podcast today is to explain what everybody's talking about when they talk about acts and define all of the terms. And then I want to show why nothing that anybody is saying about it is intelligent or even helpful at all. Because I think when you're actually writing your own story and sitting down to really think about character and plot and development and theme and all those things, I don't think it's helpful to think about structure as well. But yeah, we can get into that a little bit also. Okay, so the first person to talk about story as having different parts or segments was the Greek sort of philosopher Aristotle, who I'm a big fan of. He wrote a book called The Poetics, which has still got some very good story principles in it. He was the first person really to talk about story in any sort of shall we say, academic mindset. He's sort of like, well, we all like stories. We all, watch plays and all this kind of stuff as ancient Greeks. Here are some principles for it. Here are some things that I've noticed. Here are some things which people do. Again, people treat this observation as being very profound and almost Zen-like in its simplicity. He says every story has got three elements. It's got a beginning, a middle, and an end. You think, well, okay, how profound. But also, it's also very kind of mindless. And I hate to say that about Aristotle, but I mean, of course, everything's got a beginning, a middle, and an end. Just like every object's got a top, a bottom, and then a middle part. It's like, well, that can help you when you're kind of dissecting something, but it can't help you when you're creating something necessarily. Because, as a writer, I don't sit there and think, oh, well, this is the beginning. I'm writing the beginning now. And now I'm switching. I'm going to write the middle now. And I'm switching. I'm going to write the end. I'm aware
But don't you feel that there's a certain point that at the beginning where you need to be introducing your characters, and then you need to be establishing certain conflicts, and then,
Well, no.
You can't start introducing your characters at the end.
I don't see why not necessarily. Here's the thing: is that maybe we should start talking about Hollywood at this point because it is a kind of a cyclical system in that we're all told that stories need to have certain elements happen by certain points in the story, but I don't see necessarily why those needs to happen. But then all the examples held up are people who have taken that advice and who have written their story that conforms to a 3-act structure. And then everybody says, well, look, the 3-act structure works because this person wrote the story. Well, they've written a 3-act structure story, so yeah, it does. But there's no reason why you can't introduce an important character halfway through a story. And it doesn't actually, when you're actually sitting down to write it, I think it can actually really be something that constricts you and stops you from being telling a more creative, more original type of story, because it won't help you do things like do an ensemble cast story, where you have a lot of different characters. It's maybe very good for doing a story where you've got one hero and one villain, but it won't tell you about how your characters will react if there are multiple villains, or you've got multiple heroes, or you've got a story where there aren't really any heroes or villains. So yeah, I mean, okay, maybe this is where you start talking about what you understand as being a 3-act structure.
Okay, well, I've got a theory that I don't think it's my theory. I think I heard it from someone else, but I've often, I think it goes back to the days when film was a physical thing on celluloid, and it was on reels, and a full film would be like at least 6 reels. I think it's like 15 minutes per reel of film, and that's how they used. That's just how they used to transport them around, and because if they had the whole hour-and-a-half movie, the reel would be massive, and because when they back in those days, when they were editing, they would actually be physically cutting the film literally and sticking it back together with like sellotape, on a thing they would call a Steinbeck, Steinbeck, something like that. That's how they used to edit movies, and they would work on one reel at a time.
And then when they were projecting the movies, they would have the 5 or 6 canisters actually arrive to the projection thing, and then they would have to either stitch those all together or have 2 machines running to take over from one to the next one. So
they would normally and there's what they would call a cigarette burn, which is a little symbol that appears in the corner. And it looks like a cigarette burn. Maybe it was even literally was in some cases, which tells the projectionist that now is the time you need to start the next projection in order for it to match up. And editors, I think, would also sometimes deliberately make it so that there could be a little bit of margin for error between those 2 scenes. So that you can still see it in early movies, even up to like I think the 70s, and you'll notice that the soundtrack always finishes at those points as well, because you can still see those little marks. Because what they would do is they'd have 2 marks. They'd have one mark to tell you that it's coming up, and then one mark to say that this reel is actually finished. This is the last frame of this reel.
Exactly. So
and they'd always have like the first few feet of the next reel would be completely clear. So that could start projecting, or no, not completely clear, but completely black or clear. I can't really, probably black.
Probably
I guess.
black.
So that it would actually start running and get up to full speed, and then hopefully, if the projectionist got it right, they would, the first one would end just at the time the second one comes in. So, but because the editors are working on one reel at a time, they kind of developed this practice that in the first reel there's certain things you need to do story-wise. In the next reel there's more things you need to do story-wise. And I guess if you're talking 3 acts, then that would be 2 reels per act.
Well, yeah, and I mean if you're studying cinema as well, and I think especially with comedy, you would get like, this is a 1-reel comedy. People still talk in this terminology. And then Chaplin moved on. He started doing 2-reel comedies. And then
exactly. This is why those really old movies are quite short, like 20 minutes long.
Yeah, oftentimes. And I think, well, and here's the other thing is that because you're changing those reels, because it can be quite a jolting experience. You're trying to transition that as easily as possible for the audience to deal with this technical issue, essentially, that you've got this weakness in the technology. You know, you would change scenes a lot of the times because that would make sense. And so people did start thinking in terms of acts for those reels. And a lot, if you listen to, and I'm reading an Orson Welles book of interviews with him, and he still talks in reels when he talks about his movies. That's the way he's broken it down, because you have to think that way if you are a filmmaker in that period.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Well, exactly.
And even in as you know, like TV nowadays, if you are developing a drama for a station that's got commercial breaks, then you're timing your story to fit in with those breaks as well.
Yeah,
and
that's
they still call
something
those
else is going to bring
as
up.
well.
Yeah.
So
I was going to say that it's the same thing in television, or very similar thing, because you know that if you think of an episode of Star Trek or something like that, which is 45 minutes long, and they're probably going to have 3 ad breaks, then they want to, again, it's 3 acts. In a similar kind of way.
The directors who are facing this challenge, and the people who are doing this for TV, they can see these abrupt narrative breaks coming up, and then they want to carry viewers over into the next section. And so that's why every 15 minutes you have to have some big event in your TV show, some big reveal. And soap operas are famous for doing this. You have some big character revelation, and so you're like, oh my gosh, what's happening next?
Especially in the end of the episode. Yeah,
exactly. So either they want you to either keep watching through the commercials, or they want you to tune in next week so you can watch more commercials, because that's where you're getting your money from if you're doing this on television. And I would say that this is the only useful way to think about acts if you are dealing with this kind of a narrative problem or difficulty.
So if you're writing a novel, it's
going to be a rod for your back, and it's just going to shackle you to certain conventions and just guarantee that you're telling the same story over and over again. And I would even say movies are the same. With film technology now, people don't have to physically switch one projector on so that you get the next part of the story. It opens you up. But see, they're still stuck. I think Hollywood is still stuck in this mindset, because a lot of literature came out from this period. People started to think about, well, how can I make millions in being a screenplay writer in Hollywood now? And then a lot of people came up with analysis of the great classic movies, and they really latched on to this act thing. And now sort of act structure is some sort of like... some sort of golden phrase or concept where people think that they're saying something intelligent about story when really they're not. And people like Sid Field has got he was probably one of the biggest guys still in the field to have, so to speak, to have written about act structure, and he's got a 3-act structure that he's developed. And I've read the book. He's actually had 2 of them. Just because I guess he didn't make enough money off the first one, he was going to sell all his ideas again in a second one. But he is so prescriptive with what he's saying about act structure. He's saying, your movie script is going to be 90 pages long, because that's an hour and a half of screen time, and he literally says, halfway down page 17, you should have your Act 1 turning point. So that means that something that happens that spins the story off into Act 2 is going to happen halfway. And then he says that he came up with this theory, and then he said, oh no, I don't know if this is true or not. Then he went and looked at a lot of screenplays, and halfway down page 17 of every single screenplay, from Casablanca to Ben-Hur to this to that, there's the Act 1 turning point. And I hear people, come to these realizations again and again, and it's not just with, act structure, it's also with the hero's journey. Any sort of like story formula that people have devised, everybody thinks that they've cracked, what story is, how to write a great story. These people, by the way, have never written a good story. Sid Field, I don't know if he's ever written a movie. Robert McKee is the same. They're whatever, but it's all. I would say that it's so subjective as to saying what an event, what character. Everybody will be able to define. They will have their own little potted definition of what an Act 1 turning point is. But I think you'd be able to look at just about any story and say within the first 20 minutes, I think you can find dozens of Act 1 of quote unquote Act 1 turning points. I remember
Yeah.
before I went to film school, I was going to sit down and really kind of, figure out story and movies and, how a story on film works. And I sat with a notepad and my VHS player, and three of my favorite movies at that time, and just literally wrote down everything that happened and when. So I took Star Wars for the first one. It's like, okay, 000, movie starts. Zero four two. The opening crawl ends, and the starfighter goes across. The rebel blockade runner gets captured by the Star Destroyer. The stormtroopers break into the thing. R2D2 and C3PO run across a corridor. All that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And so I just filled up pages with just everything that happens in every every significant event that happened in the Star Wars story. I made a note of and when it happened. And as you can imagine, there's maybe 300 entries that I got from plot points that happened. And I would look at those and try to figure out, okay, well, where's the Act 1 turning point here? Where's Act 2 start?
Yeah.
Where does Act 3 start? And you just can't make sense of it at all. I think the only way you can is if you say, well, the Act 1 turning point must have happened at minute 17, and then you look at minute 17 and, oh, hey, here's Obi-Wan Kenobi is meeting Luke Skywalker for the first time. That must be the Act 1 turning point. Whereas actually,
it kind of is, but it's just,
it kind of is, but you could back up and say, okay, well, it must have happened at minute 15. Oh, R2D2 meets Luke Skywalker for the first time. That must be the Act 1 turning point.
Well,
Luke Skywalker's parents died.
Message.
Exactly, Luke Skywalker's parents were. That must be the Act 1 turning point. So I think it's very much of a self-fulfilling prophecy.
There's so many things that could be the Act 1 turning point, I guess, in Star Wars,
So I'm only going to balance this out by saying
why does a writer need to restrict themselves to just one turning point like that? I guess is another.
And I think it is something that if it's unhelpful for when you're writing, because I see people using this formula. There are a lot of very formulaic movies. The one that sticks out in my mind always is Twister, because they almost title their characters mentor and antagonist and all this kind of stuff, because everything is happening so formulaically in that movie for no real reason or purpose. There's all this generated conflict that doesn't naturally come out of the story or the environment or the characters or the plot, and it's just because they've decided they're going to really stick to this hero's journey story formula, and they're just going to ride it to hell if that's where it takes them. And I don't think it's a successful story because of that. I think it's a much weaker one. And they haven't just sat down and thought, well, naturally in this situation, how would a character really react? How would these events really truly play out? And so I think that it's much better to let your story grow organically than to try to sit down and think, man, I'm at page 17 and a half in my movie script. I don't even know what my Act 1 turning point is going to be. I better go and figure that out. It's like, well, just think about what's the natural thing to happen next. What's the most suspenseful thing to happen next? What's the most detrimental thing to your character to happen next? What's the biggest obstacle you can throw? I think these questions are a lot better for your story than to think, well, shoot, now it's time to do Act 2, and I don't even know what we're going to where my Act 1 turning point is. So,
but isn't it useful though, just to play devil's advocate? Isn't it useful to have a structure in mind and to be able to sort of plan things out to know what's going to happen and I mean, if not scene by scene, but act by act as well. So what those main points of conflict and resolution and climax are before you even start writing things out. It's good to have a sort of plan.
I think I would say that if it helps you to break down your story into sections and look at those sections differently, then yes, absolutely. By all means, because it is a big ordeal to write a book, to write a movie. If it helps you say, what, I'm not even going to think about this second half of this story until I've got the first part worked out because there's just too many factors. I say absolutely, yeah. Don't because
you might want to write the end first and then
never write the end first. Yeah, no,
okay,
I'm just kidding.
Sorry.
But I mean, I guess I mean, writers are different. Some are very analytical. Obviously, I'm a very analytical author. My dad, for instance, he's very intuitive. He he just has a feeling that he's working towards. He doesn't even have an ending in mind. Usually he just has a feeling or a smell or whatever to just kind of lead him towards that end point. But I see. Okay, so I would say that a lot of this debate about structures, and I made the point earlier that it is mostly by people who are not writers. They're kind of story analysts, and someone like Joseph Campbell, he was an academic. He was just putting forth theories about story and myth. He wasn't actually writing anything himself. I would say it's the difference between the difference between kind of studying story in that context and actually writing a story for yourself is the difference between being a doctor who performs a post-mortem on a body and being someone who actually gives birth to a child. Giving birth to a child
Right.
is actually more of a natural process. It's more of a, it's very creative. It's generative. It's, a lot of it is instinctual. Sometimes you do need to have a
Yeah.
little bit of head knowledge to help you in that. And I speak as someone who's,
But it sort of happens
who's
by itself to an extent.
yeah, I speak as someone who's watched his wife do this process now twice. There can be analytical parts that will help you do it. It's like you go in for blood work and you need iron. It's like, okay, well that's fine. That doctor has got that different outside knowledge of what childbirth is. But if you're actually giving birth to your story, to your child, then it is a very different process to someone who comes in later and cuts it open and says, well, here's where the rib cage starts and here's where it ends. Here's where the skull starts and ends. These are not questions that you ask when you are gestating a fetus in your body. You don't say, well, okay, look, like we're 3 weeks into creating our child. I guess we got to start thinking about noses now. It's a very different kind of thing from the inside out and from the outside
Well, it's
in.
almost like, in that analogy, it's almost like having a baby is something that happens to you rather than it's something that you do.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of looking at it.
Do you know what I mean?
That's what it can feel like as well
do you
with
think
stories.
that analogy works though, is in terms of like writing a book? Do you think, or a story? Does that
to someone
does it
who
happen
is
to you rather than something that you actively do?
Yeah, to someone who's intuitive, to an intuitive writer, you hear people talk about it in that way. That a story is something that they just kind of fall into, and you hear a lot of times authors talk about getting to a certain point in their story and their characters just taking over. Like the characters take on a life of their own, and they don't, obviously. It's all
But it's
happening
coming from within
subconsciously.
them, but it's coming from exactly. It's coming from so deep within their subconscious that it's a place that they didn't know existed, I guess. So,
and then you can get other writers who, again, like myself, who are very analytical, who do write down character motivations, and I write little biographies for my characters and their hopes and their dreams, and so I need, because of how my brain works, I need to have that kind of on my surface consciousness as I'm writing, and that still helps drive me forward to still create a story which doesn't necessarily need to have a structure. So, all right, let's back up and start talking about what we mean by acts, because I feel like some people may not be fully convinced by my point of view that you don't need to have an act structure going into it. So as we were saying, Aristotle said that every story's got to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And then there was a Roman poet called Horace who started to talk about a 5-act structure. And just as we were talking now about early cinema and the way television still operates, I think we have to understand the context that they were talking about stories and acts as well. And Horace especially, Aristotle grew up in a Greek tragedy tradition. There's also like Homeric ballads and stuff like that, which I don't think anyone's ever claimed the Homeric ballad has any sort of structure breaks in it. But even with Horace, I think he did coin the term act, actus. And what he meant by that, his I don't know Latin at all, but what he said on it basically is that every story ideally should have 5 acts. Now we think we know what that means in our current context, but in the context he was talking about Greek tragedy, which is we talked briefly about this in an earlier podcast, but it's the Greek chorus, sings often or chants, a certain period of verse, and then someone steps out. That's the actor, and he. This is also the protagonist. He's the first person to to talk, essentially. He has a little bit of dialogue as a character. A next person, the antagonist, steps out, and they talk a little bit. And then they step back into the chorus, and then the chorus does this other part. So those sung chorus parts comes in between the acts, the actual acting parts as well. So you have singing, acting, singing, acting, singing, acting, singing, acting. And Horace says, ideally, you should have 5 acts, within that,
Right.
for that play. So really what he was saying is arguably...
So it's an act as opposed to a song.
Yeah, he's not being prescriptive for what those acts actually do. He's not saying, well, this act should do this act should do that, as everybody else after him has been saying. He's just saying, well, this is kind of in the same way we would say, every movie should be about 2 hours long, just because that's as much as you can stand most of the time. If it's a really good movie,
Yeah.
it can be 3 hours long. If it's, otherwise it can be an hour and a half. But as a rule, that should be what we're looking at. Now, people have started to.
But then Shakespeare, just to play devil's advocate again a little bit, Shakespeare, or are you getting to this? Shakespeare, does clearly break his plays up into acts, and more than 3, I think, right? Is he following Aristotle's system, formula? Or
No, I'm going to let you flounder on this a little bit.
And that's more than. In his acts are more than just, a bit of acting, and then broken up by a song or something. His plays are more in depth than that. So what's going on there?
I mean, did he write in acts, Colin?
Well, maybe he didn't, and someone just put the acts in later. Like
this is the thing. So I've looked into this. No, I've looked into this. That is exactly what happened.
Right.
Now we're zipping ahead to Elizabethan theater, which is fine, which is good, and now we've got all these Shakespeare plays. And we flick through them. They've all got 5 acts, as you're right in saying that there are more than 3, with a variable number of scenes within those acts. And then you've got this German, he's a playwright actually, but he also a story analyst. He says, look, Shakespeare is written in 5 acts, and here's how he wrote these 5 acts. This is what happens in each of his 5 acts. And then he's got various kind of definitions like prologue, rising action, conflict, falling action, and then denouement. This is where people start really talking about kind of acts theory, still in the context of theater, where again, we've kind of largely dispatched with the singing, as a narrative part of each play, and then for some reason these acts these acts have kind of just cropped up now in. Yeah. It's important to realize that we only have
even though according to like Aristotle's original definition, if you're just cutting out all the music and the songs, then it's just 1 act.
Yeah, essentially, yeah. If you haven't got that stuff, yeah. And it's debatable as well as to how much singing there actually was, or even if it started with singing, or maybe it was all singing. We only have 33. Greek tragedies from the hundreds and hundreds that were written in that period, and only from 3 authors as well. But in any case, so we've got Shakespeare coming on the scene. Now, we have to back up and say that there is still a lot of mystery about Shakespeare. There's a lot of disputes about whether Shakespeare actually wrote Shakespeare, which are, again, unhelpful for actually understanding Shakespeare. It's also important to know that we don't have anything that Shakespeare has written above 3 pages that he wrote for a play that was not his own. So we've got some handwritten fragments of a play called Sir Thomas More that we believe to be in Shakespeare's handwriting. So we don't have notes that he made. We don't have his plays. We don't have anything. We don't have Shakespeare's notebook or his plot book or his diary or anything like that. All we've got are these plays, and we even have some missing Shakespeare plays. 3 or 4 of them, and then we've got some plays which only exist in a folio collection. So there would have been more plays that we missed if we didn't have that folio. He started to have books collected and printed from his works in the early 1600s, and these are called quartos. They're very cheaply produced. Some of them are called the bad quartos, and it seems like someone has been to a couple Shakespeare plays and mostly remembers some of the famous scenes, and he's kind of written from his memory, which is still pretty impressive, but there's a lot of mistakes in it. Then we have some better ones, which are probably taken from some written source material that we've now lost. So they would have been either what the actors had used to memorize their lines, or they would have been, maybe they did have Shakespeare's papers from that time, but since those have since been lost. Now, those quartos do not have any sort of act break or scene break at all. You can actually find these online. Check to see if I'm lying. I'll put it in the show. All the links in the show notes. They just start in. This character enters and this character enters, and they have this dialogue. Then these characters exit. These characters enter. We have this dialogue. All of the stuff about acts and scenes came later in those folio editions, the more deluxe edition versions, and it seems like they were just kind of added. Kind of post facto, To me, it's like the Bible. The Bible is not written with chapters and verses in it. In the same way at Shakespeare, he may have used a structure, but I can't find myself inherently any structure in Shakespeare. There's not a certain point where each of his plays reaches a crescendo. There's not a certain point in each of his plays where they have an Act 1 turning point, whatever that is.
Not even like. Isn't there any? I mean, obviously, I think the comedies would be different from the tragedies and the histories. Are they? Do they not? Is there not some similarity in the different?
Well, here's the thing. I'm a big advocate for not reading Shakespeare. I mean, I do read Shakespeare, but I think everybody should ideally watch him. Yeah, or do what I do. I have a lot of audio tapes of Shakespeare, and I listen to those. And so I keep listening to those, and I for the life of me, I wouldn't be able to tell you in Hamlet, which act and which scene this speech takes place. Just because you can't intuit any of this stuff from actually experiencing the plays. Again, it may help you to discuss it all later afterwards if you can all talk about an act in a scene. If you're going to break it down, but to actually experience it,
in order to put on a production. In order to put on a production, you need to break it down and say, okay, this week we're going to rehearse this scene. So giving it a name, saying, okay, we've got to have Act 1 fully rehearsed by this date, and in Act 2 by this date. It helps you to just schedule the logistics of production, but it doesn't actually have anything to do with the story.
Exactly, yeah. And, a lot of times when you see these quartos reproduced these days, they'll just number the scenes. So I've got a King Lear of one of the early quartos, and it's just got scene 1, scene 2, scene 3, scene 4, up until scene, 67 or something like that, which, why not, the case I'm trying to make here is saying, I'm trying to just debunk this thing. Well, Shakespeare wrote in acts. And people will say, well, Shakespeare wrote in a 5-act structure, and here it is. Here's how Shakespeare wrote in his act structure. Completely oblivious to the fact is that no one can prove one way or the other that he did or he didn't write in this form. What we now think of as a 5-act structure is coming from the 1800s, this German playwright called Gustav Freytag. And he's saying, here it is, I've cracked Shakespeare, here's the answer, everybody. And it's like, well, not really. There's actually more going on. And by using what he calls a 5-act structure isn't actually going to help you write like Shakespeare. It might help you understand it a little bit. But even so, I mean, it is in the same way that the Act 1 turning point, what actually makes that in a story is so ambivalent. I would say that all of these definitions are just so unhelpful as to be misleading. And again, this is my big beef with academics is that just because you name something doesn't mean you understand it. Is like,
or even that it's true.
Yeah, well, because here's Act 1. The Act 1 is the prologue. This is where all your beginnings things happen. It's like, really, Sherlock? This is where the start is where the start happens. Okay, fine, let's do that. And then you've got rising actions in Act 2. It's like, okay, well that's rising action. Then in Act 4 you have falling actions. It's like, okay, well let's just now take a moment and let's just talk about what the great rising acts. Well, let's just list all the great rising actions in literature and cinema. It's like, no one knows. Like, that doesn't mean anything. You can't think, well, this is a rising action and this is a falling action. Those terms only have purpose in saying, well, this is an action that happens at the beginning and this is an action that happens more at the end. Like, but I mean that's still just kind of that's you can see how I'm just getting so wound up with this because these
Yeah.
things aren't actually helping you figure this stuff out. You know, it's just a smokescreen.
Yeah.
And it's
So
it'll help
should we
producers
move on?
talk.
Should we move on a little bit before
Okay.
you burst the blood vessel?
Okay.
Okay. So act structure you're saying is not, even though we've been talking about doing an episode on this for months.
Yeah,
What you're basically saying is act structure is not helpful for writers. So
that's correct. Yeah.
So what is? How should all of these people who are just started NaNoWriMo this month, what should they be? Should they be planning their story out? You know, should they have an idea of what's going to happen at the beginning, middle, end? How do you do it? And,
Okay,
and
so
how,
first of all, my advice to writers who are starting out or still struggling to be writers is to say, be the kind of writer that you are. There's not one type of writer. There's not one correct way to write a book. Whatever helps you to get words on a page and keep those words, good words on a page, do that, above all else, And, I kind of also balance that out is I try not to be too superstitious about it at the same time, If it helps you to write, if you find that you're more productive, as I am, at, 2 p.m., then make 2 p.m. your sacred time where you write and try to fill your day with other things. If you're a morning person, write in the morning, before everybody else in your household gets up. Whatever helps you be productive, do that sort of thing. Do not try to be this sort of person I've heard someone say this, like, oh yeah, I must have this type of notebook and I have to go to this coffee shop at this time of day so the sun is hitting this table at the right time in order to be inspired to do all this kind of stuff. So try to weed all those superstitions out and really try to get to, where's my most productive point?
It sounds to me like those people are just looking for excuses to fail.
Exactly. Yeah, it's like I didn't get my words today. That's because this happened. And I think a lot when you get those superstitions, then when you don't have your notebook anymore, then suddenly you can't write. And so you don't
not do it.
Yeah, you don't want to be the sort of person who's beholden to a certain type of pen. If they stop making that pen, then what? You're going to finish your writing career. Try not to get any of that stuff. But then also, just try to just be aware. Know thyself. Find out what kind of writer you are.
But then, what if you do find those things helpful? Like,
well, I said it earlier. It's like if you do need to kind of, it's a big ordeal to sit down and write a book. And I had one friend who said, I've got a very clear idea of the first 2 chapters, but I have no idea where I'm going after that. And I said to him, I was like, well, look, I mean, how many chapters is your book going to have? Maybe 50? It's like you can't sit down and know what's going to happen in all 50 chapters before you write your book, because you're not going to want to write it at that point, if you plan out in that much detail. I said, just write the first 2 chapters. And I said, I predict that you will know what happens in chapter 3 by the time you finish chapter 2. And lo and behold, he did. And we were both writing books at the same time. He finished his book way before I finished my book. He just tore through it. He's like, this is great. I've cracked it. It's like, well, yeah, you can't have an entire book in your head before you sit down to write it. So yeah, that's all.
And that's kind of the essence of NaNoWriMo, isn't it? Mm-hmm. It's like get started and
just dive in and just keep writing, which I think is great advice. And I would say to people who are saying like, oh no, I planned an act structure, like I needed to do this. Am I in trouble now? I say no, of course not. Like if it does help you to break up your story into sections, then absolutely do that if you're that kind of writer. But don't worry about when you introduce conflict. Don't worry about when you introduce the mentor figure. Don't worry about all this kind of stuff. Just be sensitive to your story, live in your story, and just create naturally, thinking, well, what would my character's natural reaction be in this situation? And then write that and just have that be what carries you forward, instead of thinking.
And you can always adjust the pacing and things like that in editing, right? That's what that's for.
Yeah, but here's the thing: is that I think that if you start doing that, we're going to get a lot more originality in our stories than what we've got with the Hollywood structure. what they call a 3-act structure, but what they really mean is telling a certain story, usually often a very violent story. We're going to get stories that do have, more characters in it, that have different types of characters in it, that have different resolutions, that have, surprising resolutions. I've been watching some. I joined the library a few months back, and over here now in America, I think the limit is like 75 items, or it's like 25 DVDs and as many books as you can fit in your apartment, basically. So I've just been gathering all sorts of stuff. I joined one library, but it's actually it's a network of 3 libraries, so I can pull things from anywhere. And I've been going back and looking at a lot of stuff which I've kind of half watched or missed some parts. And I watched this episode of Justice League Unlimited. It was the last episode that they did for that cartoon show. And it was a Batman storyline. And it was just such a simple one, but it just hit me so hard. And also, again, I'm a new father, so a lot of stuff is hitting me harder than it used to. But yeah, it was a story about this girl who'd been created by this place called the Cadmus Project, who could turn her ideas and imagination into reality. And she was sick, and these things were starting to take over the city. And basically she had to be killed before she died naturally, because then like hundreds of thousands would die. And so they had this device that would kill her, and Batman said, I'll take it to her. And they say, Batman, are you sure you know what you're doing? He says, yeah, I'm the one to do this. And so he goes and he finds this girl who apparently can read minds. And the girl says, like, you've come here, but I know that you haven't come here to kill me because I've read your mind. And Batman says, yes, I haven't. And he throws the device away. And she says, I can also see that I'm dying soon, aren't I? And Batman says, yes, you're going to die soon. And she says, they've made me a weapon. They didn't give me a childhood. And then Batman says, I know what that's like. I know what it's like not to have a childhood and to turn yourself into a weapon. And then she just says, will you stay with me? And Batman says, yeah, I'll stay here. And so Batman sits down on a swing next to her. He holds his hand out, and the girl, puts her hand in his. And that whole moment is just Batman staying with this child who's going to die and just waiting with her, because he feels and knows what that's like. And even now I'm getting a little bit choked up because, again, having a child, it brings up a lot of stuff that you're going through. And this hit me, and I was just like bowled over by its simplicity, because within the episode I was watching, it was maybe a 4-minute sequence. And by the way, she decides to turn everything back the way it was, and then you see Batman, all of the the visions disappear, and then Batman walks out, and obviously she's died. And see, this is the thing, is that nothing that doesn't conform to any sort of things that they're telling you to do in your acts. Batman didn't change at any point. Nothing new is revealed about his character. Nothing that any of these people are telling you needs to be in a story is in that story. There's no mentor figure. There's no sidekicks. There's no. The antagonist is just this little girl who Batman deeply identifies with. And.
Yeah,
but it is still so powerful. There is a conflict, but
it's not what you. Yeah,
it's shown that it's
conflict.
Yeah, exactly. It's not a traditional conflict. So, if you are going to be beholden to doing this kind of act structure, then you are going to miss those sorts of stories. You're going to miss a different way of telling a different story, giving something new to the canon of Western literature. You're just going to be making Die Hard on a boat or something like that.
You mean Speed 2.
Exactly. Yeah. And but see, this is the thing, is that you go to a production company and say, hey, let's make Speed 2. They say, yeah, great, let's do it. Make it exactly. That's why this system keeps getting perpetuated, is that, Hollywood doesn't want to take risks. They don't want to tell the new story. They just want to tell the old story again, so they can get the old money again.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know. I don't know if that's convincing or not. But I mean, I've got more prepared. There is. I'm going to put some more links in the notes. There's actually a really good guy who I follow on YouTube. His channel is called Lessons from the Screenplay. He does very thoughtful videos, and this is what actually got me thinking about this. Is I think when we were starting to talk about this podcast, I'd watched a few of these videos, and he does do one on act structure, 3-act structure, and 5-act structure, and it comes his. He started thinking about it because there was a David Fincher quote that came out. It's like, film companies today, they only want to do the 3-act Marvel structure, and we want to tell, as creative auteurs, which he thinks he is, we want to tell a different sort of story than what the 3-act structure will allow, which is actually nonsense. And then in a later the sequel video to that is about David Fincher's Girl with the Dragon Tattoo movie, which I read the book. I did not see the movie. The book was horrific, and the movie looks to be a faithful adaptation to that extent. At one point, David Fincher says, "Oh yeah, we went into this story thinking we had a 3-act structure, but then realizing it was too complex a story, and we had to wrap our minds around a 5-act structure." It's like, well, that's just nonsense as well, because everybody says that the 5-act structure is not a more complex form of story than the 3-act structure. It's just more detailed. So the 5-act structure fits inside of the 3-act structure and just breaks it down a little bit more, in the same way that the hero's journey would break it down a little bit more. So even David Fincher doesn't even know what he's talking about. And that's only one on the list of reasons why I've grown frustrated with him. And this is all just saying, it's like these are people who are trying to explain what it is that they do and not really understanding what it is. And I guess this is another thing, I'll advocate for this again. It's like, just feel your way through this story. Art is about communicating emotion. And this is,
and that's where that deeper truth is. That's what we're talking about in our truth and story episode. Yeah. It's, it's about finding a deeper truth. And if you restrict yourself to a formula, you're less likely to be able to do that. I think so. Yeah. People might disagree, but I think you've summed it up completely adequately. Yeah, I don't feel the need to say anything more after what you just said. Okay. Yeah. So shall we end that there then? Yeah, we can end that there. Okay, so if you are doing NaNoWriMo and you found this helpful, or if you found it helpful even if you're not doing NaNoWriMo, let us know on Twitter with #FictionHack. And to find our newest episodes, you can search for Fiction Hack on SoundCloud and probably some other podcast devices or apps as well. And to read our show notes, visit our website, fiction-hack.com. And you can also follow us on Facebook, where we've got a Fiction Hack fan page. We're also on YouTube. You can find me on Twitter. I'm Colin_Munro. That's MUNRO. And Ross is at Ross Lawhead, all one word. You can also find me on Instagram, where I'm also at Ross Lawhead, and you can see what I'm reading and currently watching. And I also have a website, which is just Google that. Just Google Ross Lawhead, and the website will pop up. And a massive thank you to the Devlon Lamar Organ Trio, who performed the fantastic music that we've used in all our episodes, and we haven't credited them as often as we should have done. No, so apologies for that. Yeah. But yeah, we'll see you next time. Yeah. Thanks for listening. Be excellent to each other. Keep watching the skies.
I'm burping so much. Oh, it's a Taco Bell, that's why. Da, 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 da.